I didn't learn what betrayal sounded like through shouting. I learned it through laughter. It happened at a Christmas party that wasn't even mine. A room full of expensive perfume, polished smiles, and the kind of curated conversation that felt less like talking and more like trading. Names, titles, future plans, social proof. And I was there, standing beside the man I'd been building a life with for 18 months. My boyfriend, Julian Hale, 29. Charming in that smooth, camera-ready way, like he'd been trained to keep his face relaxed, even when his mind was calculating something. He worked in social media marketing, the kind of job where your value could be measured in clicks, followers, and who you were photographed next to. He'd invited me to his agency's Christmas party like it was a milestone. Not for us. For him. For his career. Just try to fit in, he said in the Uber, voice light, like he was asking me to try a new appetizer. But the way his eyes flicked down my outfit told me he wasn't talking about my personality. I wore a simple black dress I'd owned for years. Clean lines. No logos. No shimmer. No loud statement. My coat was thrifted. My earrings were small. My makeup was minimal. I looked like myself. Apparently, that was the problem. The restaurant was in Belltown. All glass and soft lighting, and servers who moved like they'd been taught that silence was luxury. When we stepped inside, I felt that familiar shift, like the air itself had rules. Julian straightened his shoulders. The host greeted him by name, and before I could settle into the moment, Julian's hand found the small of my back and pressed, guiding me, positioning me, like I was a prop he needed placed correctly. His team was already gathered around a long table near the center of the room. Young professionals, dressed in expensive neutrals and loud confidence. Everyone looked like they'd stepped out of a top 30, under 30 photo shoot. Julian's face changed when he saw them. It softened, lifted, became brighter. Like he'd been dimming himself with me in private and finally got to turn the dial back up. "Babe," he murmured, "this is Talia and Mira, and..." I didn't even get a full introduction before the measuring started. Thalia was the kind of woman who spoke like she was used to being listened to. She wore a sleek red dress and a watch that caught the light every time she moved her wrist, on purpose. Her eyes swept over me, quick and sharp. Not rude, not openly, just precise. Mira sat beside her, smiling with her mouth but not her eyes. Her ring was large enough that it had its own presence. She rotated her hand on the table like she wanted everyone to notice it. They greeted Julian with enthusiasm. They greeted me like I was an accessory he'd picked up last minute. I sat down, smoothed my dress, and let the first 5 minutes wash over me. Bonus talk, vacation talk, promotions, titles. I've been in rooms like that before. Rooms where people talk about money without saying money. Rooms where the subtext is always, who matters here? Who doesn't? Julian leaned into the conversation instantly, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, nodding at stories that sounded like bragging disguised as hardship. And I did what I always do. I listened. I smiled when required. I stayed supportive. That was the thing about loving someone. Sometimes you show up to places you don't like because you know they matter to the person you care about. I kept telling myself it was just a party. Just one night. Then Thalia tilted her head toward Julian, voice loud enough that the tables around us could hear. "Okay," she said, grinning. "Can we talk about this?" Julian laughed. "About what?" Thalia's gaze landed on me. The smile didn't change, but the temperature did. About how she dresses like a broke intern. The words hit the table like a dropped glass. A small silence. A few snickers from someone down the line. I felt it in my chest first. Heat, then stillness. I didn't turn my head quickly. I didn't flinch. I just held my drink, took a calm sip, and looked at her like I was processing whether she'd really said that out loud. Mira's lips curved. "Oh my God," Mira breathed, laughing. "Thalia." "What?" Talia shrugged, innocent. "I'm not wrong." Then, worse than Thalia's voice, Julian made a sound. Not a defense. Not a correction. A laugh. Small, like he was trying to keep it light. Like this was playful. Like the right move was to go along with it. My stomach dropped so fast I felt dizzy. I looked at Julian. Just once. A simple glance. And in that glance, I asked him a question I didn't want to say out loud. "Are you really doing this?" Julian didn't meet my eyes. He just leaned closer to Talia and said, "She's low maintenance." Low maintenance, like I was a cheap subscription. Thalia smirked. Low maintenance is one thing. But Julian, come on. This is a Christmas party. People are looking. People are always looking, I said quietly. It wasn't a comeback. It was just a fact. Thalia blinked like she hadn't expected me to speak. Mira jumped in, eager. Honestly, she said, tilting her head at me, you could do so much better than this whole struggling vibe. She gestured vaguely at my coat draped over the chair. And I mean that in the nicest way, she added quickly. Julian's laugh came again, weaker now. You guys are ridiculous, he said, but his voice held no anger. No boundary. No protection. A different man would have said, "Stop, that's my girlfriend." Julian said nothing that mattered. Thalia leaned back, satisfied. So, when are you upgrading? She asked Julian like I wasn't even there. Like, are you planning to date like an adult soon? Mira lifted her wrist. My husband just bought me a Cartier watch because I deserved one. What did yours get you? Talia asked. A Target gift card? Laughter again. I sat very still. It wasn't the joke. It was the way Julian let it land on me like it was mine to carry. Julian glanced at me, nervous now. But instead of fixing it, he aligned himself with the room. Well, he said, forcing a grin. Tessa's sweet, but yeah, she's not exactly playing in the same league. Something inside me cracked. 18 months. And now I was a consolation prize. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out. I smiled, because I didn't want them to see the exact second my heart broke. So I smiled, took another sip of my drink, and let them laugh. Seconds later, the room shifted. The door opened. Stellan Briggs walked in. He scanned the room. Then his face lit up when he saw me. There you are, he said warmly. I was hoping you'd be here. Julian froze. Stellan stopped beside me. Tessa, he said easily. Perfect timing. Are you ready to change the world again? Silence. Hey, Stellan, I replied calmly. Just enjoying a Christmas party. Our board signed off, he continued. 200 million. They're all in. Thalia stopped breathing. Mira couldn't blink. That AI exit you pulled off, Stellan said. Brilliant. And this new platform, revolutionary. Julian's hand reached for my arm. Possessive. Panicked. I didn't look at him. We should talk details later, I said. Forbes is calling, Stellan added. They want you. Then he was gone. And the truth stayed. Julian, no. Not the man I loved. Julian grabbed my arm. Oh my God, he said. Why didn't you tell me? Like my success was something I owed him. I gently pulled my arm free. I stood, picked up my coat. I think I'm going to head home, I said. What? Stay, Julian said. Everyone wants to meet you now. That was the problem. Everyone wanted me now. Not before. I looked at him. And I understood. Julian hadn't been ashamed of my money. Julian had been ashamed of me, until he thought I could buy his place in the room. I got it, I said. And I walked away. I didn't always live this way. People assume simplicity is a phase, something you grow out of once you make it. That if you have the means, you'll eventually want the upgrades. The address with prestige, the clothes that announce your worth before you speak, the kind of lifestyle that explains you to strangers. For me, it was the opposite. Simplicity wasn't a lack of ambition. It was a decision made with precision. Long before Julian, long before that Christmas party, long before anyone laughed at the way I dressed. It started with my parents. My father was brilliant. Not the loud kind of brilliance, the quiet, obsessive, late-night kind. He built software systems in the early days, back when nobody knew which ideas would survive. When one finally did, it didn't just change our bank account, it changed the air in our house. Suddenly, everything had a price. Conversations weren't conversations anymore. They were negotiations, favors disguised as concern, compliments that came with expectations attached. People didn't ask how my dad was doing. They asked what he was working on next. My mother changed too. Not overnight, gradually, subtly. She started talking about money like it was proof of arrival, like wealth itself was a personality trait you had to perform correctly. There were new friends, new tastes, new standards that none of us had agreed to, but all of us were expected to meet. By the time they divorced, I was old enough to understand something important. Money didn't ruin their marriage. It revealed what it was built on. I watched my father grow quieter, more guarded, unsure which relationships were real. I watched my mother chase validation that could never quite fill the space where intimacy used to be. And I promised myself something then. If I ever had money, it would never be the loudest thing about me. Years later, when my own company took off, that promise was tested. I was 29 when the acquisition closed, an AI platform I'd built from scratch. Years of late nights, ramen dinners, debugging sessions that blurred into mornings. When the offer came in, it was surreal. Not just the number, but the speed with which everything changed afterward. Lawyers, advisors, meetings where people spoke to me differently before I'd even said a word. I signed the papers, and then I went home to the same apartment. Same furniture, same grocery list, same habits. I sold the company for enough money that I'd never have to work again if I didn't want to. And then I went back to work anyway. Not because I needed to, because I wanted to. I downsized my life instead of inflating it. An older car, a modest apartment. Clothes that felt like me, not like armor. Not as a test. As a filter. I didn't tell people about the exit unless it was relevant. I didn't correct assumptions. I didn't perform success. I wanted to know who would choose me without the numbers. That's how I met Julian. We were introduced through mutual friends at a low-key gathering. No labels, no pretense. He was charming, attentive, easy to talk to, asked thoughtful questions, laughed easily. He told me he worked in marketing. I told him I did consulting in tech, which was true, just not complete. We bonded over small things, cheap takeout, long walks, splitting checks without awkwardness. He never flinched when I suggested staying in, never complained about my place. For a while it felt simple, real. Julian didn't care where we went as long as we were together. He didn't ask about titles or long-term plans in that probing, evaluative way I'd come to recognize. I thought I'd done it, found someone who saw me. Then the world started leaking in. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It started with his friends. Dinners where comparisons crept in casually. Someone's new apartment. Someone else's promotion. Vacation photos passed around phones like trophies. Julian didn't participate at first. He listened. But listening can be a kind of absorption. "Don't you ever want more?" he asked one night, months in, lightly, curious. "More what?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just more." I told him I was happy. He nodded, but something shifted behind his eyes. The comments became jokes. The jokes became patterns. "You're really low maintenance," he'd say. He'd say this, like it was a compliment and a warning all at once. His friends started noticing, too. "Why don't you dress up more? Why don't you push her to aim higher? Why is she so comfortable?" I didn't realize how much of this he was absorbing until it started changing the way he looked at me. Like I was a reflection he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. I could have told him. At any point, I could have sat him down and explained everything. The company, the exit, the reason I lived the way I did. But I was watching something unfold. I wanted to see who he'd be if he thought this was all there was. Because love, real love, doesn't require proof. It requires alignment. The Christmas party was just the moment everything became visible. A pressure point. A room that demanded performance. Julian wanted to belong there. I could feel it. The way his posture changed. The way he scanned faces for approval. And I realized something quietly, long before Stellan walked through that door. Julian wasn't embarrassed by my clothes. He was embarrassed by what he thought they represented. Ordinariness. Limit. A ceiling he didn't want to hit. I wasn't his partner in that room. I was a liability. And when his friends laughed, he didn't just let them. He joined them. Because it was easier than standing beside me. By the time Stellan spoke my name, the test had already been taken. The room's reaction didn't shock me. Julian's did. Not because it revealed my success. Because it revealed his priorities. Money didn't change how people saw me. It exposed how they already thought. That night wasn't about a secret being revealed. It was about a truth finally having nowhere left to hide. And as I walked away from that table, coat in hand, I understood something with absolute clarity. I hadn't hidden my life to deceive anyone. I'd lived honestly, quietly. And the people who couldn't love me in that quiet were never going to love me at all. There's a moment in every relationship when you realize you're no longer being seen as a person. You're being assessed. It didn't happen loudly with Julian. It crept in through side comments and glances he didn't think I noticed. Through pauses where there hadn't been pauses before. Through questions that sounded curious but landed like evaluations. It was subtle at first. A dinner with his friends where someone casually asked what neighborhood we lived in, and Julian answered before I could, adding a justification I hadn't asked for. A brunch where someone joked about starter apartments and Julian laughed a second too long. A night when he scrolled through photos on his phone, someone's penthouse, someone else's vacation, and said half to himself, "That must be nice." I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I assumed it was noise. What I didn't realize was that noise, repeated often enough, becomes a frequency you start tuning yourself to. Julian's friends operated on a scale. Everything had a rank. Careers weren't jobs. They were signals. Relationships weren't connections. They were leverage. Even happiness had to look a certain way to count. Thalia measured worth in accessories. Mira measured it in milestones. And Julian started measuring himself by proximity. At first, he framed it as concern. I just don't want people to underestimate you, he said once, as we were getting ready to meet his friends. His tone was gentle, reasonable. Who's people? I asked. He hesitated. You know, people. People meant them. The next time it sounded like advice. You don't have to downplay yourself so much, he said, adjusting his jacket in the mirror. You could present a little more confidently. I looked at him. I am confident. He smiled. I know, just externally. That word externally stuck with me. It meant my confidence didn't translate into status. And status was what he was starting to crave. The comments from his friends grew sharper as Julian grew quieter. They didn't insult me outright. They didn't have to. They talked around me. Some people are just comfortable being comfortable, Talia said one night, swirling her drink. Not everyone wants to push. Mira nodded. It's fine if you're not ambitious. Just be honest about it. I watched Julian's face as they spoke. Not angry. Not defensive. Thoughtful. Like they were giving him language for something he'd already been feeling. On the drive home, he was quiet. Did that bother you? I asked. He shrugged. They didn't mean anything by it. I waited. He added, they just expect more. From me? I asked. A pause. From us, he said. That was new. Us had a standard now, and I hadn't agreed to it. I started noticing the way Julian positioned me in public, how he'd steer conversations away from my work if it sounded too vague, how he'd emphasize his own projects more, like he needed to compensate. He began dressing differently, talking differently, performing. And the more he performed, the more I felt myself becoming background. One night, after a dinner that left a tight knot in my chest, I asked him directly, do you think I'm holding you back? He laughed too quickly. No, of course not. But he didn't say why. Instead, he said, I just want us to be on the same page. I thought we were. I thought being together meant choosing each other over an audience. But Julian was starting to see the audience as part of the relationship. Something to manage. Something to impress. I didn't blame his friends. They were honest about who they were. Julian was the one changing shape around them. And the hardest part wasn't the judgment. It was the way Julian stopped meeting my eyes when they spoke, as if looking at me would force him to take a side. By the time the Christmas party invitation arrived, I already knew something was wrong. The way he hovered when he handed it to me. The way he said, it's kind of a big deal for work. The way his excitement was threaded with anxiety. That party wasn't about celebration. It was about positioning, and I was about to learn exactly where I stood on his scale. By the time we reached the Christmas party, the outcome was already decided. I just didn't know it yet. Julian was nervous. That was the first sign. Not the usual kind, the kind that comes with excitement, but the kind that comes with anticipation. Like he was waiting to be judged. In the Uber, he said, these people matter for my career. Then, after a pause, so just fit in. I nodded. That was all that needed to be said. The night moved fast. Too fast. One moment we were standing together. The next he was laughing with them, at comments that landed on me instead of him. Not defending, not correcting, participating. That was the moment I understood. I wasn't standing beside him. I was standing between him and the room. When the jokes turned into suggestions about upgrading, about aiming higher, Julian didn't push back. He leaned in. He smiled. And in doing so, he made his choice. I felt it settle in my chest, quiet and final. Then the room shifted. I didn't need to look to know what had happened. I felt the pause, the attention turning. I looked up just in time to see Stellan Briggs walking toward me. He didn't hesitate, didn't scan. He came straight to my side. There you are, he said easily. I was hoping you'd be here. Silence. Tessa, he added, like this was ordinary, are you ready to change the world again? That was enough. No explanations, no numbers. Recognition did the rest. Stellan spoke briefly about our work, about what was coming next, about the future. I barely listened. I was watching Julian. The man who had laughed was now staring at me like I'd slipped out of his control. Stellan moved on. The room stayed altered. Julian turned to me, voice tight. Why didn't you tell me? Not, are you okay? Not, I'm sorry. I took my arm out of his grasp. I'm heading home, I said. What? Stay, he said quickly. Everyone wants to meet you now. That was the problem. Everyone wanted me now. Not when they thought I was ordinary. I looked at him and saw it clearly. Julian hadn't been embarrassed by my money. He'd been embarrassed by me. Until the room decided I was worth something. I got it, I said. And I walked away. I didn't cry on the way home. That surprised me. I'd always assumed that if a relationship ended, really ended, it would be loud, messy, full of tears that blurred streetlights and made you pull over just to breathe. Instead, the city slid past the Uber window in silence. I watched reflections of buildings stretch and collapse across the glass, my own face layered faintly over them. Calm in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. Not numb. Clear. My phone buzzed once. Then again. Julian. I didn't look at the screen. I didn't need to. The pattern was predictable. Confusion first, then defensiveness, then panic once the reality started to sink in. By the time I got home, there were already 5 messages waiting. Why did you leave? That was weird, Tessa. You embarrassed me. You should have told me. We need to talk about this. I set my phone face down on the counter and took off my coat. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt intentional, familiar, safe. This was my space. No audience, no performance, no one watching to see if I belonged. I poured myself a glass of water and stood there, hands resting on the counter, letting the night settle. For the first time since the party, my chest tightened. Not from what his friends had said, from what Julian hadn't. The next morning, I woke up to 12 more messages. The tone had shifted. Less accusatory, more careful. I didn't mean it like that. They took it too far. You know how they are. I was just caught off guard. You blindsided me. Blindsided. Like my life was something I'd sprung on him without warning. I waited until the afternoon to respond. Not to punish him. To make sure I was answering from clarity, not reaction. When I finally replied, it was simple. I'm not angry. I just need time. He responded immediately. Can we meet, please? I just want to understand. Understand. That word felt heavy, because what he really wanted was context. Numbers, explanations, a framework that made him feel less small. We met 3 days later at a cafe he'd chosen. A nicer one than usual. That didn't go unnoticed. Julian was already there when I arrived, posture stiff, eyes alert. He stood too quickly when he saw me, like he was afraid I might disappear if he didn't move fast enough. You okay? He asked, reaching for my arm. I stepped just far enough away that his hand missed. I'm fine, I said. He nodded, swallowing. Good, good. We sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table. He started, then stopped. I didn't know. I waited. You should have told me, he said finally, about everything. There wasn't anything to tell, I replied. He frowned. That's not fair. Why? I asked calmly. Because you feel embarrassed? No, he said quickly, because I was defending something without all the information. Defending. The word almost made me smile. Who were you defending? I asked. He hesitated. Us, he said, a little too quickly. I let the silence stretch. Julian shifted in his chair. Look, he said, voice softening. I always knew you were special. I mean, there was something about you. I just didn't realize how big. How big? Not how kind, not how steady, not how present. Big. I studied his face as he spoke. This was a different Julian than the one from the party. More attentive, more careful, more invested. Not because I'd changed. Because his perception of me had... I don't understand, he continued. Why would you hide something like that from the person you're with? I didn't hide, I said. I lived. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I liked our life, I went on. The one you thought was small. That's not what I thought, he said defensively. I met his eyes. Then why were you laughing? He looked down. For the first time, he didn't have an answer ready. I was just trying to keep things light, he said eventually. You know how they get. Yes, I said, I do. That was the problem. He reached across the table, stopping short of touching me. Things can be different now, he said. We can be different. Now. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not pain. Understanding. What's different about me now? I asked. Julian blinked. What do you mean? What changed? I said evenly. Between the night of the party and today. He opened his mouth, closed it. Tried again. He gestured vaguely. I didn't know the full picture. So if I was still just a consultant in a modest apartment, I asked, would you be sitting here talking about a future? He didn't answer. He couldn't. And in that pause, everything clarified. Julian wasn't malicious. He wasn't cruel. He was something more dangerous. He was conditional. He wanted the version of me that elevated him, not the one who'd been standing quietly beside him all along. I need to go, I said, standing. Julian looked up, panic flickering across his face. Wait, he said. We can work through this. Communication, expectations, therapy, if you want. I shook my head gently. This isn't a communication issue, I said. It's a values issue. He stared at me, like he was trying to find the argument that would make me stay. There wasn't one. As I walked away, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because it was over, but because I finally understood what it had been, and why it couldn't continue. The strangest part wasn't the breakup. It was how quickly Julian adjusted. Not emotionally. Narratively. In the days after our conversation at the cafe, he didn't spiral the way people do when they lose something they genuinely valued. There were no late-night calls filled with regret. No apologies that cracked under the weight of realization. Instead, there was Reframing. He texted like someone updating a draft. I've been thinking a lot. I see things differently now. I think we were just misaligned before. Before. As if the problem had been timing. As if the version of me he'd dismissed had simply been an early iteration. Unfinished, unpolished, waiting to be corrected. I didn't respond. Not because I was trying to be cruel, because I was watching something unfold. Julian wasn't mourning the loss of a relationship. He was mourning the loss of access. When we finally spoke again, briefly, because we still had logistical loose ends to tie up, his tone had shifted completely. He was warm now, curious, almost reverent. I keep thinking about everything you've built, he said. It's incredible. I recognized the cadence immediately. I'd heard it before. Not from people who loved me, but from people who wanted proximity. It didn't change last week, I said. He laughed softly like I was being modest. I know, but still. Still. That word did a lot of work. Julian started talking about things he'd never mentioned before. How he'd always wanted to live somewhere nicer. How he'd felt limited by his circle. How maybe we'd been playing small without realizing it. He was rewriting us as a partnership that had been waiting for the right moment to expand. As if I hadn't already been whole. He suggested dinner one night, somewhere new. Expensive. I made a reservation, he said, proud. I figured it was time. Time. I declined. He didn't push. But I could hear the confusion underneath his calm. The next time we spoke, he brought up moving in together. Casually. Strategically. I've been thinking, he said. Maybe it makes sense to start building something more concrete. Together. What does concrete look like to you? I asked. He hesitated. A better place. Something with space. Something that reflects where we're headed. Where I was headed. He talked about condos in neighborhoods he'd once called impractical. About entertaining clients. About visibility. Not once did he mention how he'd made me feel. Not once did he ask what I needed. Julian wasn't trying to fix what he'd broken. He was trying to upgrade what he'd undervalued. And that's when it hit me. He wasn't in love with me. He was in love with what I unlocked. Access. Status. A room he'd always wanted to belong to. I started noticing the language he used when he talked about me to others. Not directly, I wasn't there for most of it, but word travels. Someone mentioned he'd been telling people he was dating a tech entrepreneur. Someone else said he'd referred to me as the brains behind a major platform. Not my name. Not my character. My resume. The night it finally settled into certainty was quiet. No argument, no revelation. Just a message from him that said, I think we could be really powerful together now that everything's out in the open. Powerful. Together. Now. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed back. You didn't want me when you thought I was ordinary. There was a pause. Then, that's not fair. It was fair. It was accurate. Julian wanted the version of me that made him feel successful. Not the woman who had sat beside him in silence while he laughed along. And I realized something else. Something that stung more than the party ever had. If Stellan hadn't walked in that night, if the room hadn't shifted, if my value hadn't been externally validated, Julian would have let me walk out of his life believing I wasn't enough. That was the line. That was the point of no return. I didn't need another conversation. I didn't need closure. I needed distance. So I told him we were done. Clearly, calmly, without blame. He reacted the way people do when the story they're telling themselves gets interrupted. Confused, defensive, almost offended. I thought we were moving forward, he said. We are, I replied, just not together. After that, his messages slowed, then stopped. And for the first time since the Christmas party, the silence felt earned. Distance has a way of rearranging your perspective. Not dramatically, not all at once. Quietly, like furniture being moved in the dark. In the weeks after Julian faded out of my life, I started noticing something I hadn't had space to notice before. The people who didn't change. They didn't suddenly ask questions, didn't look at me differently, didn't recalibrate their interest based on what they thought I could offer. They stayed exactly where they were, and that mattered. Riven was one of them. I'd met him at a climbing gym months earlier, before the party, before Stellan, before any of it. He was easy to be around in that way people are when they don't need anything from you. We climbed. We complained about sore hands. We grabbed cheap pizza afterward. At some point, the story about me started circulating through the tech-adjacent circles in the city. It always does. Names get passed. Details get distorted. Riven heard it secondhand. The next time we climbed, he mentioned it casually, like it was trivia. So apparently you're kind of a big deal, he said, tying his shoes. I waited for the shift. It didn't come. That true? He asked. Parts of it, I said. He nodded once. Cool. Then he stood up and said, You still down for pizza after? That was it. No awe, no recalculation, no sudden curiosity about my bank account. Just continuity. Celeste was another. She managed the restaurant where the Christmas party had been held. I didn't know her name that night, only that she noticed. After Stellan walked away and the room buzzed with speculation, she came over quietly. Not to congratulate me, not to network, just to ask, "Are you okay?" I nodded, surprised by how much that simple question landed. "Being put on the spot like that can feel overwhelming," she said. Money or not. She had no reason to care, no incentive. She just saw someone who looked uncomfortable and responded with basic decency. Those moments stayed with me, because they reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten while trying to make a relationship work. Kindness doesn't need context. It doesn't wait for validation. The people who passed weren't impressive. They were consistent, and that consistency became the quiet metric I started measuring everything else against. Julian had wanted to talk about growth and future and potential. But the people who mattered to me were the ones who showed up the same way regardless of circumstance. That clarity changed how I moved through my days. I went back to the routines that grounded me. Volunteering at the elementary school in South Seattle every Tuesday. Teaching kids basic coding logic. Helping them build small things that worked. And watching their faces light up when they did. They didn't know anything about exits or valuations. They just knew I showed up. That was where I met Daniel. He was one of the teachers. Quiet, steady, the kind of presence that didn't announce itself. We talked in fragments at first. Scheduling, supplies, what worked for which kids. Over time, those fragments stitched together into conversations. About education, about systems that failed quietly, about how progress didn't always look like innovation. It often looked like patience. He knew I worked in tech. That was it. No curiosity beyond that. No pressure to explain myself. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was being evaluated. I felt met. There was no rush, no performance. Just two people noticing the same problems and caring in compatible ways. One afternoon, a student mentioned seeing my name in an article, something about entrepreneurs in Seattle. Daniel asked me about it later, casually, like he was filling in a gap. So I told him, all of it. The startup, the exit, the choice to live quietly, Julian. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded. That explains why you think about sustainability differently, he said. You're not trying to impress anyone. You're trying to make things last. That was his takeaway. Not the money, not the scale, the intention. That's when I knew the difference. Julian had wanted to be adjacent to success. Daniel cared about impact. And I finally understood what I'd been searching for without realizing it. Someone who chose me when I looked ordinary. Someone who didn't need the room to shift to see my value. I didn't rush into anything with Daniel. Not because I was afraid, because I didn't need to prove anything anymore. After Julian, I'd learned the cost of acceleration, how quickly momentum can turn into pressure, how easily intention gets replaced by expectation. With Daniel, there was none of that. We existed in the same rhythm before we existed in the same story. Tuesdays stayed Tuesdays. Volunteering stayed volunteering. We talked while packing up laptops, while walking to our cars, while waiting for the last parent to pick up their child. Conversations that didn't reach for significance, but somehow became meaningful anyway. He never asked where I lived, never asked what I drove, never asked what my next move was. He asked things like, "What made you care about this? What do you think would actually help? What do you wish people understood better?" Questions that weren't ladders. Just doors. The shift came quietly. No declaration, no moment that demanded recognition. Just one afternoon, when the school's heating system failed. It was sudden, middle of winter, classrooms cold enough that kids kept their coats on all day. The district didn't have emergency funds lined up. Paperwork moved slowly, too slowly. I watched teachers adapt in real time, reshuffling rooms, bringing in space heaters, trying to keep routines intact while their breath fogged the air. Daniel didn't complain. He stayed late, helping rearrange lesson plans so kids could rotate through the warmer spaces. That night, I went home and made a decision. Not emotional, practical. I covered the cost of repairs through a foundation. Anonymous, clean, no strings attached. No announcement, no credit. Just action. When the principal told the staff the next morning that emergency funding had come through, the room went silent. Then relieved. Then emotional. Daniel sat in the back, head down, hands clasped, breathing out slowly like he'd been holding it all in. Later that day, he found me in the hallway. "They fixed it," he said, disbelief softening his voice. "I heard," I replied. He smiled, not at me, but at the idea that the kids wouldn't have to shiver through math anymore. That's huge, he said. Someone really cared. That word stayed with me. Cared. Not impressed, not amazed, not indebted. Cared. That night, when we walked out to the parking lot together, he stopped beside his car and looked at me. Not with urgency, not with expectation. Want to grab coffee sometime, he asked. Simple, unloaded. I said yes. It was different from Julian in every way that mattered. There was no recalibration when Daniel learned more about my life. No shift in posture, no new plans suddenly attached to me. When I eventually told him about the heating system, months later, carefully, without drama, he didn't freeze or glow or start imagining what else could be solved. He asked one question. Did it help? Yes, I said. He nodded. Then you did it right. That was it. No pedestal, no projection, just alignment. And that's when I realized the turn hadn't been dramatic because it hadn't needed to be. I wasn't choosing something new. I was returning to something steady, something honest, something that didn't need the room to change in order to matter. People assume the hardest part is letting go. It isn't. The hardest part is unlearning the version of yourself that stayed too long. After Julian, there was a quiet reckoning, not dramatic, not painful in the way breakups are usually portrayed. More like inventory. I started noticing the habits I'd picked up while trying to make myself easier to accept. The way I'd softened my opinions, the way I'd downplayed my work, the way I'd stayed silent in rooms where speaking would have made things uncomfortable for him. None of that had come from insecurity. It had come from accommodation. Julian had wanted harmony. His friends had wanted hierarchy. And I'd mistaken endurance for love. Once that illusion broke, something else took its place. Stability. Not the flashy kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself but holds. Life settled into a pattern that felt earned. Work moved forward at its own pace. The partnership with Stellan's company launched smoothly. No spectacle, no rush. The platform did what it was designed to do. Solve the problem it was meant to solve. I did the Forbes interview because it made sense strategically, not because I wanted visibility. The article came out. People reacted. Then the news cycle moved on. Nothing about my daily life changed. That mattered more than I expected. Julian reached out once more. Not directly. Through a mutual friend who mentioned, carefully, that Julian had been having a rough time. That the breakup had affected him more than he'd anticipated. That he was reevaluating things. I didn't ask follow-up questions. Not out of bitterness. Out of completion. I knew what reevaluating meant in his world. It meant recalculating his position. Finding a way to narrate the loss that didn't implicate his values. I wished him well, and I meant it. Daniel never asked about Julian. That absence spoke volumes. Our relationship didn't move fast, but it moved forward. Naturally, without milestones designed to impress anyone else. We cooked together, walked, talked about the kids at school, what worked, what didn't, which systems failed quietly, and which people showed up anyway. He met my friends, I met his. No one needed context. No one asked for proof. One night, months in, we sat on my couch in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't demand filling. You're very steady, he said eventually, not as a compliment, more like an observation. So are you, I replied. He smiled. That's probably why this works. He was right. What lasted wasn't chemistry or excitement or potential. It was alignment. Julian had wanted my future. Daniel respected my present. That difference reshaped everything. I used to think the lesson was about money, about hiding it, about revealing it, about whether I should have said something sooner, or trusted someone more, or protected myself less. But that was never the point. Money didn't end my relationship with Julian. It just removed the noise. It stripped away the excuses, the reframing, the gentle language he used to justify moments that didn't sit right with me. It revealed what he valued when he thought no one important was watching, and what he valued when the room decided I mattered. Julian didn't love me poorly. He loved me conditionally. And that distinction took me longer to understand than I'd like to admit. I think part of me believed that if I stayed patient enough, quiet enough, supportive enough, he would eventually see me the way I needed to be seen. That love could be trained. That values could be negotiated. They can't. Not the ones that count. What I learned, slowly, quietly, is that love isn't proven in moments of admiration. It's proven in moments of embarrassment. When someone is willing to stand beside you, when doing so doesn't elevate them, when they don't need the room to validate you before they do, when they don't flinch at ordinariness because they understand that consistency is its own kind of power. Daniel never needed to be impressed. He didn't need to recalibrate his expectations once he understood the full scope of my life. He didn't rewrite our story when new information appeared. He stayed. The same tone, the same pace, the same respect. And that steadiness did something profound. It made me realize how much energy I'd spent trying to be acceptable instead of simply being myself. The irony is, the version of me Julian wanted, the impressive one, the valuable one, the one worth showing off, had existed the entire time. He just couldn't see her without external permission. Daniel didn't need permission. He saw me helping kids debug a simple project. He saw me research systems that failed quietly. He saw me show up, week after week, without applause. That was enough. People still ask me sometimes if I regret not telling Julian sooner, if things might have turned out differently. I don't. Because if knowing the truth changes how someone treats you, then they weren't responding to you in the first place. They were responding to what they thought you could become for them. I didn't lose a relationship at that Christmas party. I lost an illusion. And in doing so, I gained something far more valuable than approval or admiration. I gained alignment. I learned that I don't need to be impressive to be loved. I need to be chosen. When I'm quiet, when I'm ordinary, when there's nothing about me that elevates anyone else in the room. That's the version of me worth committing to. And that's the version someone finally did.